Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along. We really do appreciate you coming here today for the Queensland Heat Health Community of Practice event entitled Building Heat Resilient Queensland, which is both an intention and a question. How do we do it and what does it look like? So we're really pleased to have some spectacular panelists with us today to talk about this question, give their views on it, and then we'll have a panel discussion on it. But we're very interested, as always and ever, to get input from audience members, both in person and online. So thank you all for making the time and coming along. My name is Dr. Tony Matthews. Myself and Associate Professor Shannon Rutherford, there in the second row in the purple, are the founders of the Queensland Community, or Queensland Heat Health Community of Practice, or the QHHCoP as we sometimes call it, or with assistance from the wonderful Anna Jackman, who many of you will know from prior events and other things. I'm going to do a quick introduction and some housekeeping this afternoon, and then I'll turn over to the presenters, and then I say we will have a discussion after that. So, of course, to open our meeting with an acknowledgement of country, Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of this land, and of course all of the other lands that anyone who's joining us online might be meeting on. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and indeed to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who might be with us today. We welcome you also. Wonderful to have you. Just a very quick look at the schedule, very short introductions. We'll be doing panelist presentations for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we pivot across to a Q&A, followed by conversation and refreshments afterwards. Some quick housekeeping, mostly for those online. Keep your microphones and cameras off if you could, please. Use the chat to ask questions. Please don't just jump on the mic. Raise your hand if you have a complex question. And also please note that the event is being recorded, so if anybody doesn't want to be recorded, you have the option to leave when we are recording the event. And as I've said, I'm leading this project with Associate Professor Shannon Rutherford. We've met many of you before. We look forward to meeting you properly afterwards. We're about a year into this now with generous support from the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University, and looking at least another 6 months of firm activity, and we have plans for many years afterwards. So more on that later, but this is the fourth event of the QHHCoP, and I'm very pleased to have this one here today. Today we're going to be getting some scene setting before we hear from our four panelists, from Professor Brendan Mackey, who's with us from Griffith University, and Brendan's going to be giving us one of his doom-laden presentations, let's say. But it is good scene setting and important scene setting. So what I might do is quickly just share Brendan's bio, and then I'll hand over to him for 10 minutes. So Brendan is the director of the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University. He's also a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2. And he's the head of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility at Griffith. He has a PhD in ecology from the ANU, and is coordinating for the IPCC Working Group 2. He has special expertise in climate change, forest ecosystems, biodiversity conservation, and terrestrial carbon dynamic. He has expertise in the application of GIS, remote sensing, and environmental modelling to problems of environmental and climate change. Professor Mackey is the lead on a number of externally funded research projects, including research projects in the Pacific about ecosystem-based adaptation, information systems and decision support for adaptation research projects, primary forests and climate change research projects, as well as also whales and in the changing climate, which is an interesting one as well. So Brendan, I'm very happy to hand over to you and let you set the scene for us, please. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me and asking me to speak to you for a reality check on what the science has to say about climate change, global warming and climate heat risk. And I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on whose land we meet, and to add that I'm going to vote yes in the referendum. So I'm going to be talking about, and you would have heard this a lot about degrees of global warming, and I just like to make the point that I can't read this because I don't have my glasses, so I'm just going to pause and get my reading.
I might have to borrow them.
They're very expensive and attractive reading glasses. So there you go. So when people hear, we talk about limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. Some people, if you live in Siberia or Canberra, you think that's great. A degree warming would be good. But you need to really understand it as an index. It's analogous to a thermometer reading of Earth's health. Everyone here would know that healthy body temperatures around 36 to 37, 38 degrees is indicative of a fever, and 40 is life-threatening. Your GP would be rushing you off to emergency ward. Well, a healthy Earth temperature is 0. It's 0 above what it was around 1850 when the Industrial Revolution started. No, it's just an average surface temperature of Earth averaged over a year. It's just an indicator of how much Earth's climate has changed. We're currently experiencing 1.1 degree of global warming. I would suggest that's equivalent of a fever, and as I'll explain shortly, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level, so you could consider to be equivalent to a life-threatening 40 degrees. So every increment of warming, every 0.1 of an increment of global warming represents a massive change in Earth's climate system. And that graph there shows observed global warming over the last 70 years. And you can see around 1980 things really started to flip. The colours represent different El Nino, La Nina years. And the point there is when it's a La Nina year, everything's a bit cooler, but La Nina years are actually hotter than El Nino years were back in the 1980s. That's how much everything's warming. This is this graph just shows projections between now and the end of this century, 80 years' time, degrees of global warming. You can see the projections range from 1.5 to 5 degrees. Well, that's because we don't know what's going to happen. But we do know this, there's another 0.4 degree of global warming already locked in, and we're likely to reach it by 2030. So we've lost the opportunity to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees. If you think about it, that means we're going to see as much climate change and as much global warming in the next 10 years as what we saw in the last 20 years, because in 2002, we had about 0.6 degrees of global warming. So if you think about how much climate change has occurred in the last 20 years, we're going to see as much again in the next 10 years. What happens after that really depends upon our level of mitigation ambition and which of those colour trajectories we follow. It's still technically possible to follow the blue path and limit global warming to around 1.5 degrees. Current government policy and plans as they're being implemented will deliver us, if nothing changes, about 3 degrees. And as I said, impacts and risks increase with every increment of global warming. So this is what we're seeing in Australia. That graph just shows the change in observed Australia's average temperature over the last 100 years, and there's kind of a map of that. That shows two things. One is we've had actually about 1.5 degrees global warming above Australia. We've heated a bit more than the global average, and everywhere in Australia has got hotter. And that's one of the ubiquitous impacts of our global warming. Everywhere gets hotter. And this is one of the big findings from the last IPCC report. That climate trend, as we call it, of rising average temperature, which sounds very innocuous, actually is driving an increase in climate extremes. We're seeing an increase in the frequency and duration and severity of all extreme weather events experienced in Australia as droughts, floods, storms, bushfires and heat waves. And again, this is observed change in extreme heat days from the 1.1 degree of global warming or the 1.5 degree Australian warming since 1910, and it's showing the number of days of extreme heat days, to keep it simple. And you can see it's escalating in a non-linear fashion, and you can see the last, how much it's changed since the year 2000, which is about there, right? And we're going to see as much change in the next 10 years. And I think most people here would know that of all the natural disasters in Australia, these are fatalities, and extreme heat is by far the biggest, by a factor of, it's more than twice that of floods, more than 3 times that of tropical cyclones, maybe 4 times that of bushfires, or even lightning. It's the #1 cause of fatalities in natural disasters in Australia. And this is an interesting projection from Queensland. Queensland has very good modelling of future climate. There's a Queensland Future Climate dashboard, and this plot here is just showing basically projected heat waves in 2090, in 70 odd years' time, if current emissions continue as they are. Actually, emissions are going up each year, not decreasing, but if they were just to stay at this level and keep going. And you know, the brown there, this is heat wave duration. The brown there for South East Queensland, heat waves are 20 to 30 days long, and dark brown is 30 days long. And the dots show an estimate of heat wave frequency, the number of days a year. And you know, we're looking between 50 to 100 days a year of having heat wave events. So it's a very serious matter. And finally, this is, I would just direct you to our IPCC report. It's in Working Group 2 for Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation. There's a chapter in it called Chapter 11, which is Australasia, where the assessment's focused on Australia. And towards the end of that chapter, you'll find this is an excerpt from the table where we identify key climate risks for our region. And risk number 7 is an increase in heat-related mortality and morbidity for people and wildlife. Let's not forget about wildlife. Flying foxes, lactating flying foxes drop out of trees once heat waves hit a certain temperature, as do juveniles. And with droughts with low oxygen levels, we have mass kills as well. But certainly for people, people are differentially exposed, as we say here. There's certain occupational groups such as outdoor workers and those living in urban heat islands, which are more exposed than others. We also know that people's socioeconomic status affects their vulnerability. We know that young, old, sick people, those in lower quality housing and lower economic status generally, and those served by fragile utilities are more vulnerable, as are remote locations with extreme heat and inadequate cooling in housing infrastructure, including many remote Indigenous communities. Those bars on the left, we call them burning ember diagrams, and again they show levels of global warming. As I said, we're currently on track for 3 degrees, and the 2 bars show the risk from heat-related mortality in Australia with kind of low adaptation response and moderate adaptation. And you can see in both cases it stays yellow, which is kind of moderate risk, up until around 2 degrees. So that, if you like, is a very important point. When it comes to heat impacts on humans, there's a lot we can do to mitigate those risks. There's a lot of adaptations that we can undertake that will lower the risk, lower the exposure and reduce the vulnerability. And we've detailed or listed some of those adaptations there. Many of them are design features such as urban cooling interventions, including irrigated green infrastructure, increased albedo. There's various other behavioural and other design and structural things that can be done to reduce people's exposure, reduce their vulnerability. So I guess that's good news, is that at 1.1 degree, even at 1.5 degrees, even up to 2 degrees, there's a lot that can be done to mitigate the risk to people from extreme heat waves. But I would just point out that we are going to hit 1.5 degrees in about 8 to 10 years' time, in which case the risks escalate to high. And there's only one level above high, which is very high. So that is a quick overview of what the science is telling us. summary, again, we're at 1.1 degree of global warming. We're going to hit 1.5. That rising average temperature is driving an increase in the frequency, intensity, duration of heat waves, amongst other factors. And this is something we can't ignore, and we have to start thinking about how we can mitigate those risks through various adaptation strategies and options. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan, for setting the scene for us. I'm sure we're all aware of the scale of the challenge. Our first panellist to join us after Brendan is Thompson. Ian is the Acting Inspector General for Emergency Management here in Queensland. He's worked at the office of the IEGM since March of 2021. Ian recently led the review into Queensland's disaster management arrangements, which was handed to the government on the 28th of April this year. Prior to working for the IGPM, Ian served for 38 years with Queensland Police Service and was awarded the Australian Police Medal in 2014 for his distinguished service. Congratulations. Ian was a detective in Cairns and on the Gold Coast, staff officer to the QPS Commissioner, and held liaison and assistant roles to both the State Coroner and the Police Minister. Ian also worked as project manager on the QPS G20 Task Force, was a program manager for the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games, and was involved in the QPS response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ian holds a master's degree in criminology from the University of Cambridge and master's qualifications in leadership and management from the Charles Sturt University. Would you please join me in welcoming Ian?
Thanks, Andy. And I would also like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet here in Brisbane, in Meanjin, the Turrbal and Yabra peoples, but also recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be from land where people are joining into us online as well. I'd like to recognise their elders past, present and emerging. People might ask what the Office of the IGEM is doing in a Queensland heat community practice. And I suppose first of all is to point out that heat waves and heat events are considered disasters under the Queensland Disaster Management Act. And because they're considered disasters, the Office of the IGEM has a responsibility to the community and to the state under Section 16C to regularly review and assess cooperation between entities involved in disaster management to make sure that their plans and their responses are suitable and compatible with the conditions that they're faced with. Heat waves are disasters. As has previously been said, heat waves lead to more fatalities than any other disaster event in the world. And if you think of some of the tragic earthquakes and cyclones and hurricanes that hit Southeast Asia and some of the more populous countries, you would think perhaps that they might overtake heat wave, but they don't. A heat wave is an insidious thing because people tend to ignore it, turn on the air conditioning, which is not good for global warming, I would imagine, and don't think about the ongoing consequences of it. In 2018, the Office of the IGEM conducted a review into the Queensland bushfires report, and it was review number 2. And the first recommendation that the Office made as a result of that review was that Queensland's plans and arrangements for heat wave should be reviewed to provide for an integrated, multi-agency approach to their management, and that a single agency should lead and oversee this process. That single agency is Queensland Health. And the fact that it's a recommendation for an integrated multi-agency approach leads me to the tenet of what the Queensland disaster management arrangements are, and that is they're locally led by local governments and local communities, supported by districts, facilitated by the state, and where necessary, supported by the Commonwealth. But it underlies a shared responsibility of everyone in the community to do something about it, and for everyone to have a shared understanding of the risks that they face, and then to take action based on the risk appetite they might have for whatever that could be. For example, if we're talking about bushfires, I might have a risk appetite that would allow me to stay in my house and prepare to fight the fire if I'm living there by myself. If my elderly mother, who is wheelchair bound, comes to stay with me, my risk appetite will change, and I'll then need to change my behaviours. And that might mean that I need to evacuate earlier or take some other course of action. So the responsibility is on me to have a shared understanding of that risk, as well as a shared responsibility to do something about it. In 2019, the Queensland State Hazard Risk Assessment identified heatwave as the third most significant issue facing Queensland. Cyclones, bushfires and floods, of course, are always first and foremost in a disaster-affected state like Queensland, but heat wave, as we're learning, is going to become more and more frequent, and we need to make sure that we have responses in place to look after that. What we need to do is incorporate heat into the risks that we already face. So even if we're in the middle of a flood, we could still be having a heat wave day, because there are a lot of floods in Queensland where it's not raining. It might rain hundreds of kilometres away. As the flooding comes down the river, community gets isolated. If there's a heat wave at the same time, humidity will go up and there'll be all sorts of consequences that perhaps if we hadn't included heat as something that we should be thinking about in our plans, we need to do so. So the Queensland Disaster Management Arrangements are our all hazards approach, and it uses the comprehensive model, which is more commonly known as PPRR, prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And it's not a linear equation, it's something that is circular. So you never finish at response and wait for an event to start at prevention. It's a circular equation. And when combined, if we do all of those things properly, we'll build resilience in our community, in our institutions and in the cities and places we go to. I think what we need to make sure for the future is that we don't do this in isolation. Queensland Health might be the responsible hazard-specific agency for heat, but they can't do it alone, nor should they do it alone. This is a national, international, statewide response. We are going to get in Queensland people who will move to Australia, forced migration due to global warming, whether that's from the Torres Straits down to the mainland or whether it's from the Pacific or Islands. We will have people who will move to Australia because they can't live in their own country anymore. And we have a responsibility with them to see what we can do to prevent and prepare and respond to these events. So it's a shared responsibility across all of the community. You would have seen with the recent floods last year in the northern New South Wales area that a lot of people were on the news talking about how they had to rely on each other to be rescued because the government couldn't get there in time. I'm not being critical of the New South Wales government at all, but those sorts of situations are going to happen more and more into the future as we get more significantly severe events compounding on top of things like COVID or something else, or cascading from a cyclone straight into a bushfire, straight into a heat wave, straight into a flood. People are just getting hammered day after day after day by disaster events, and it's only going to get worse. We do know that the frequency of cyclones will reduce, but the severity of cyclones will increase. So we may get less of them in Queensland, but they will be more severe and they'll be more damaging and people will be impacted further. So the more we can do now to reduce global warming, reduce the climb in the temperature and perhaps reduce that 70 to 100 days of heat wave for us all, the better we can be. So one of our functions is to make sure that we work with the entities performing emergency services, departments and the community to identify and improve disaster management capabilities. What we do is we do things called assurance activities. We do capability reviews of government departments and their plans to make sure that they're up to scratch, that they recognise the risks that they are facing and that they include those risks in their plans. We've recently completed a review in Queensland's disaster management arrangements. And it was an opportunity for the Office of the IGN to have a look at the history of the arrangements, where they started back in the early 1900s, right through to today, and to help design a system that, if government accepted our recommendations, would be better for Queensland in the future. And one of the things that we did do was really highlight the need for partnerships and working in cooperation. And that includes the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous First Nations law, people who are culturally and linguistically diverse, people living with a disability. All of our plans and all of our responses have to be inclusive of everyone because everyone has a part to play in this. One of the other things that was recommended and accepted by government was the establishment of the State Disaster Management Group, which won't necessarily mean anything to the people here in the room or online. But the State Disaster Management Group is comprised of the Director General of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and it's co-chaired by the Commissioner of the Queensland Police Service, who will become the responsible officer under our disaster management legislation. And it is comprised of all of the Directors General of all of the government departments here in Queensland. And if you want a stronger, more powerful group of people who are going to sit across the disaster management arrangements in Queensland and make sure that departments and agencies are doing the right thing, are preparing their plans as best they can, and that they're working together, I don't think you could ask for a better group. We're happy to say the government accepted our recommendation. So the State Disaster Management Group in due course will be established with terms of reference, and they will be responsible for the day-to-day oversight of all of the disaster management arrangements in Queensland. So if we want someone who can influence and impact the disaster management arrangements in Queensland, I think we've got just the right group to do so. Into the future, all I can really say is that we would expect, as we test and prod plans and arrangements across the government, that more and more interagency, both government and non-government, will be working together to develop plans that are consistent across the state to the risks that their local community face, that the local community bands together with local government and government agencies to make sure that their communities can be resilient too, but more importantly, plan and prepare for the disaster events as they happen further into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Wonderful. Thank you, Ian and Brendan, before you. Just a reminder as well to everybody, both in person and online, the opportunity for questions will come when all panellists have presented rather than after each individual panelist. So we will have a full panel discussion. So if you're desperate to ask a question of one or all of the panellists, please be patient and you will get an opportunity. Moving quickly along to Liza Neal, who's joining us from Moreton Bay Regional Council. Liza is a seasoned architect with a lifelong dedication to blending her passions for environment and community design. She has served as the principal architect for Moreton Bay Regional Council for 2 years after a transformative 4-year tenure at the Sunshine Coast Council. Liza worked with renowned architectural firms across Australia before establishing the award-winning practice Mango Architects with Phil Smith and actively exploring regionally sustainable design for nearly 30 years. Her design portfolio includes diverse new and adaptive projects from eco-resorts, houses, schools, all the way through to larger solar-powered sustainable factories. Very exciting. Lisa has taught at 4 universities and is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects. She chairs the AIA Sunshine Coast branch and actively contributes to various AIA Queensland committees and technical reference groups focused on regional affairs, planning, resilience, climate action, sustainability, as well as equity, diversity and inclusion. Driven by her passion for design, innovation and sustainability, Lisa pursues multidisciplinary outcomes that positively shape the future of community resilience. Lisa, thank you so much.
Okay. I'm the lightweight designer coming after some very, very intense talks, so excuse me. Right, so I work for Moreton Bay Regional Council, which is really fun, great place. Moreton Bay is just north of Brisbane, for those of you who don't know. We focus on delivery, facilitation, partnership, education, advocacy, and we do regulation. So that's generally what councils do. First of all, I should acknowledge that I come from the lands of the Cubby Cubby people. I work on Cubby Cubby, Jinnaburra and Turrbal people's lands. And Moreton Bay is the lands and the waterways. We'd like to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We recognise Moreton Bay region has always been a place of cultural, spiritual, social and economic significance to First Nations people, and we're committed to working in partnership with traditional custodians and other First Nations communities to shape a shared future that celebrates First Nations history and culture as an irreplaceable foundation of our region's collective identity. Now, this talk made me think a lot about what is Queensland going to look like in 2033? And one of the first things that I have to talk about is the stars. There's a bit of a problem with the stars. My stars are green stars and building rating stars, probably not the Milky Way, but the Milky Way is fine. I'll talk about that a bit more. We've already spoken about hazards and the risk that multi-hazards are going to bring to us. It's not just heat, it's flooding, it's cyclones, it's fire, it's everything. And by 2033, we'll be just over the Olympics. I've been wondering what's going to happen in the Olympics. Are we going to have a flood? We're about to go into El Nino. We'll probably be in La Nina by then, so that's going to be interesting. How will Queensland handle the Olympics in a flood? Big question. Great challenge. So the first thing I thought about was, well, what does a roadmap to 2033 actually look like in terms of building design? There's a lot to think about. We're grappling with a lot of design issues. I was looking at the Southern Oscillation Index because it quite fascinates me. The bottom line is from the 1890s through to 1995, and the top graphic is just a recent one from 2014 to 2023. But somewhere in the middle there, in 2019 is when we had the Brisbane, 2019 is when it was the Sydney fires. So, you know, we're about to head into one of those cycles. It's scary. So there'll be a lot of heat and there'll be fires. So essentially, we're sitting here at 2023 and Moreton Bay Regional Council is doing lots of studies for our next planning scheme. It's taken us 10 years to do a planning scheme in Moreton Bay. I think it's about 20 since about 10 for most local governments, but these planning schemes take between 3 and 5 years to write. Now, unfortunately, there's another thing that interplays with planning schemes, and that's the National Construction Code, and that changes every 3 years. So every 3 years, we're going to see those construction codes ramping up over the next 10 years. So at the moment, they're sitting at, we're about to have a new version of the National Construction Code hit in October 2023, and it's going to change the way we do sustainability. It's basically legislating that we have 7 stars for apartments and residences. Unfortunately, this brings me to the second part of this equation, which is that in Queensland we also have something called the QDC, which sits within the state planning policy. Now that QDC hasn't been changed for about 20 years, and sitting in the middle of that is MP 4.1, which basically says that Queensland only has to do 4 stars for apartment buildings, not 7. And those 4 stars can be averaged across the whole of apartment building, which means what we're seeing in Queensland now is very inferior building products being built right now. And I'm hoping that in October this year, the state government will actually bring in the legislation to enable the QDC to allow us in Queensland to have 7 stars NCC ratings for all of our apartment buildings that we're busily building for all of these people who need affordable housing. So there's a bit of an inequity. We're currently putting people who can't afford housing into apartments, and they only have to be averaged as 4 stars. In Victoria, there's 6 stars. We have a greater heating load up here, so it's really not working. Anyway, so that's going to keep ramping up over the next 10 years. The NCC is going to ramp up every 3 years. Hopefully, I'm really hoping that by 2033, we'll be sitting at 10 stars or close to it, maybe 9, that'd be good. Yeah, we've also got to hit some energy targets. I think it's, 50% renewables in Queensland by 2030 with 30% emissions. It's not enough. Listening to what's been said, that's not enough. And we're supposed to be reducing emissions to below 2005 levels down to net zero. So we're supposed to be aiming for net zero by 2030. I don't know if that's going to happen with 70% renewables. Anyway, so in the middle of this timeline, we've got El Ninos and La Ninas, and we've got ramping up the NCC requirements for buildings, and we've got planning schemes trying to keep up, and basically everybody's working really hard to keep up with all the changes. Little local governments are busily putting out lots of guidelines. Moreton Bay's put out some really fantastic ones. We've got an existing planning scheme that already talks about urban heat island, which is wonderful and surprising. Not many have that. We've just done some Your Home and Living guidelines. That's those little guidelines on the side there, which some of them talk about all sorts of interesting things like flood, and the Climate Smart one talks about heat. We've just produced an environmental and sustainability policy, which is very exciting. Other local governments are doing all sorts of amazing things with satellite imaging to work out where urban heat is happening. So you've got Parramatta City Council images, satellite images there. They've just done an amazing urban heat study. And there's lots of award-winning architecture happening, which actually works really hard to get great sustainable outcomes. This is Nightingale Village, which has just won lots of awards in Victoria, and it's won awards for sustainability as well as being a fantastic design that's incredibly affordable. So that's the kind of thing we should be aiming for. But in Queensland, we've got to look for Queensland-specific solutions. One expert said to me, Liza, it's really easy, you just green everything. And I went, I don't think it's just that. But anyway, so that's a really obvious solution. But my suggestion would be that it should be real greening, not fake greening. I don't want to see synthetic turf, that's not going to work. Okay, and the other thing we need to do is think about rewilding, because things that are not manicured actually are much better for urban heat than kind of like really manicured prune stuff. So let's just rewild everything. And that landscape has to be uncontested. So unfortunately, plant plants at the moment, you plant trees and then people run over them with cars. We've really got to get a bit smart about this and protect trees and really look after things. The other thing is we have to add water. We've got all this legislation at the moment that stops us from putting on tanks. Let's put them back on. Let's put some more fountains around the place. Let's actually retain water as much as we can. Let's do some water sensitive urban design. Many of us know what that means. That's really quite fun, but quite challenging, but interesting. And there's all sorts of wild and crazy people trying desperately to start swimming in rivers. We've got a fantastic one here. We've got some great ones in Moreton Bay. Why don't we actually make them swimmable? That'd be fun. And it will also help reduce, if we can actually reclaim our water spaces and creeks, that will help bring the temperature down as well as help with the urban greening. One thing that's always ignored is air. So we need to start really working hard to get cross ventilation. We need spaces between buildings. We need to incorporate breezes into buildings. We have to think about air filtration. So that little thing there, the little article is from the 1890s. That's about a cyclone in Brisbane, which is interesting. Brisbane has the New World City Design Guidelines, Buildings That Breathe, which is absolutely a brilliant document and everyone should read it. And the last images to the side are of Sydney in the middle of bushfires, because one of the things we're going to have to work out how to do is filter the air really well. All those people in masks, it wasn't COVID, it was bushfires. So, 1 minute, okay. We've got to choose our materials really well. Colours are really important. Everyone thinks it's roofs. It's not just roofs, it's walls. It's also surfaces, ground surfaces. We've got to work on all of that. We've got to insulate, we've got to shade, we've got to choose the correct materials, and we've got to have light colours everywhere. And I'm really happy to talk to anyone about the urban oven effect, which, is what happens if you get that wrong. There's a balance. We need to desperately design for when the power goes out. We need to work out how to be energy sufficient. Now, there's a thing called the comfort zone. Everyone's got a different one. My mother-in-law in Tasmania can survive quite happily below 0, but she can't handle above 20, whereas I'm quite happy above 30, and people in Darwin are okay with 35. So everybody has a different comfort zone depending on what you're used to. You can change your comfort zone, and we will have to kind of work that out. Now, these images here are from New York. I think it's the 1970s, 1970s, there was this huge, huge blackout, huge heat wave, huge blackout, and it was crazy. So our whole city shut down. People had to come out of their buildings, they had to sleep on the streets, they were sleeping wherever they could. They were walking out, I don't think I've got by you. I had that picture of the people walking under the bridge that were trying to get out. There were cars everywhere. It was chaos. I'd heard stories about it. When I saw the images, it's just terrible. So that's what we're facing. So basically, we have to do everything everywhere all at once. And we need the Australian government to work out the NCC and make sure it works with the QDC. We need a star rating for buildings, all buildings, and that should have mandatory disclosure on sale or lease. We need to make sure we keep our private open spaces in Queensland. They're really important to help with shading. And we need to look at the internal spaces and make sure they're really comfortable. There's a thing about having a cool room, other than a cool home, a cool room and a warm room as well. And essentially we need the local governments to get their planning schemes to move quickly. We need educational institutions with people who know design science, and we need all of industry to get on board. There's a fantastic World Architecture Conference going on in July, which is about leaving no one behind, and I think that's really important. We're going to make sure that this is equitable for everyone. And we need everybody to do it. So it's going to take a collective multidisciplinary effort to get this collaboration to happen, and we're all the stars of the future. It's not just the Olympians. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Liza. I work in a lot of design myself, so much of that made sense and resonated with me. Moving on, next we hear from Mark Stevens. Mark is a Senior Environment and Community Development Manager with Stockland, with whom he's been with for over 16 years, focusing on environmental planning, compliance, sustainability, community development, and working with First Nations peoples. Mark's qualifications in environmental science and landscape architecture have him sometimes labelled by his peers as a greedy developer. Passionate about getting the balance right between environmental protection and commerciality, he strives to ensure that the communities he works on result in positive and sustainable legacies. Would you please join me in welcoming Mark Stevens?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Also, I'd like to acknowledge First Nations people, the Jagera and Turrbal people of Brisbane, and also the Gubbi people from where I reside on the Sunshine Coast. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey that we're on and look at it from sort of a corporate perspective, but really focusing on Aura. So we're calling this the That's Cool, which is our case study for Aura. I'll talk to you a little bit about the initiatives there, but mainly it's really been driven by our cool roof policy, and I'll talk about some of those elements in a minute. But Aura is a city building project on the Sunshine Coast for 50,000 people, so it's 20,000 dwellings just south of Caloundra, and it actually has been the fastest selling community in the country over the last few years. For a regional area, it's been quite amazing. It's also a 6-star Green Star community, so it's the highest Green Star community from the Green Building Council of Australia for a master plan community in the country, and that encompasses a lot of different elements of sustainability, which is why I'm still working on the project and I still love it and still challenged by it. So it was interesting, just the future projections, and we're sort of starting to look at that business and what does that mean for us and how we look at design and community. So today I'm more talking about residential, but we're actually sort of seeing that by 2100, as sort of what's been mentioned, our climate could have increased in temperature by up to 4 degrees, maybe more. So we have a responsibility as building communities to try and get this right. What is our response going to be? And as I said, we're on a journey, we're just sort of starting this, and it's sort of been very much an awakening through our business. So if we don't do anything about it, we know that cars and buses will be the only form of transport. Our bikes and parkways and parks will just be abandoned because it's just going to be too hot and not comfortable. And there'll be an increased reliance on air conditioning for houses and homes, which then is a significant increase in the cost of living. So we do need to start thinking about how we actually approach that differently. And it's not just the comfort within a community, it's also then the health impacts it has to everyone. So, and that's mental health, it's comfort, it's the ability to exercise, everything which keeps us healthy from a mind and body perspective. So what can we do as in the development industry? So Aura has been a really interesting one because we actually started with, as part of our Green Star initiatives, being having mandating a cool roof policy. So from day one, we said, right, we're going to have light coloured roofs, so a maximum 50% solar absorbency rating. And that really just annoyed the building industry because we suddenly started to stop dark coloured roofs. Now, what it actually did is it stimulated a change where they had to bring out more colours of white, off-white, whatever white, but shades of grey. I'm not going to say no, didn't say that. I nearly went there. But one of the real key benefits, we said, right, now that the community is 5 years on, we want to be able to evaluate this. What have been the benefits? So we undertook some thermal imaging, and it actually proved that Aura as a community is up to 2 degrees cooler than our neighbouring competitor only a few kilometres away. Now that was a bit of a penny drop, a mic drop. It was just a big game changer for us because we realised there was something in this, not just from a climate perspective and building resilience for communities, but also when we're looking at the cost of living for our customers and being able to beat the bills. Oh, we've got an absolute crisis at the moment. So that 2 degrees, and just through our building covenants, means that your homes are more energy efficient, less reliance on heating and cooling, which then sort of say, well, what do we do from here? So, and this is sort of the journey that we're on. So the thermal imaging actually proved areas where there's more work that we need to do. For example, car parks, which are sort of an asphalt, and intersections where there's not much shade. And even where we've got commercial buildings and more on the residential side, that where you've got blank walls that have green facades to them, or you haven't actually designed it where you've got the right tree species to produce the right canopy cover, which does take time. But we realised that there were areas of which we can improve, and we took some inspiration by some research done in Singapore where they did a whole shopping list evaluation of areas that we could look at to improve, and that sort of led to us to then look at our next steps and stages. So we know through Aura that our cool roof policy has made a very positive impact, which beats the bills for our customers, which reduces the cost of living, but also delivering improved resilience. We know that just through doing, and we hope and we hypothesise that we can actually deliver further benefits through the research that we've undertaken to understand where those some other heat sinks are. And we even found that, and it's interesting what you said, Liza, is that if we sort of pride ourselves on affordability with some products in our urban villages and different types of housing, that even though they had cool roofs with some of these micro villages, they didn't have very good cross-flow ventilation. So there are even improvements we can do in our product design. So we know we can actually have more enhanced benefits in relation to how we can tackle that urban heat island impact. So what we then did is based on sort of these shopping list items of things that we could do, we actually then approached our civil engineers and our landscapers and our contractors to understand what are the costs associated with some of this urban heat island mitigation. And this is, as I said, the starting point. But we wanted to understand what are sort of low-hanging fruit that we can draw upon. And we know that cool roofs, no cost to customers, it's just a covenant that we can mandate. And we know that if we can look at our landscaping and our tree species, yes, if you put more trees in, that does cost extra, but if you put the right trees in that are going to deliver the right shade canopy, great. And then what other technologies can be adopted in relation to road treatments or when we're designing our buildings for more cross-flow ventilation. We've heard a lot about, and they do a lot in Singapore in terms of green roofs. That's just really not viable from a cost perspective. So we haven't ruled it out as a cross, but don't see that really being quite commercially viable at this particular point in time. There are other things actually that can be done. And some of the things which we're looking at the moment is we're actually going to start at Aura a cool streets precinct, and there are products now that are available that you can actually put over bitumen. So from a road perspective, you can do concrete, you can actually do blonde asphalt, so that's an additional cost to your normal asphalt, but then you can actually apply actual products on top of normal asphalt, which have sort of a 7 to 9 year type time frame horizon that needs to be factored into life cycle cost as well. But you can see by the imagery, and that's ours, it's just something that from some research that was done down in Parramatta, that there can be some significant impacts even to the roadways. So when we sort of pull all those things together, there are shopping lists, there are bits and pieces that we can do when we're designing our communities to improve the urban heat island resilience. It's not just affordability, it's also the benefit for the whole community. So from Stockland's perspective, whilst urban heat island has now been awakening for our business, and I'm now getting calls all over the country, what can we do? And cool roofs won't necessarily work in Victoria as they will in Queensland, so there's different approaches. But we know from our ESG priorities that urban heat island actually ticks a lot of these particular boxes. When we're looking at the decarb strategy and rewilding and bring back nature and biodiversity into our urban environments, Liza, you sort of touched on that as well. Probably argue separately about the pruning and the hedging because we still want things to look nice. But we know that there is climate adaptation resilience benefits from it. And even we feel that there's opportunities to engage with First Nations about species selections and use that as a vehicle to be able to improve how we work with our First Nations peoples. And as I sort of mentioned at the outset, the social impact and the benefits are very far reaching from the health, the physical and the mental well-being, that if we can approach this from the ground up, that's just where sustainability really needs to be looked at rather than sort of bolt-ons. We can actually look at, from an urban development perspective, really making possible tangible outputs that benefit the environment, benefit our community, that end up with a really that's cool future for the future of what urban development might look like. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. That was fantastic. Our last panelist to present before we switch to a discussion is Joel Dignam from Better Renting. And Joel is the Executive Director of Better Renting. He has a background in organising and campaigning across non-profits, unions and electoral politics. Joel has studied leadership, organising and action with Professor Marshall Gans through Harvard's Kennedy School of Executive Education, and he holds an Advanced Diploma of Management from the Group Work Institute of Australia. In 2022, Joel completed a tertiary fellowship through the US and the UK, learning from tenant movement organisations, both places. Joel, welcome you and look very much forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Welcome, folks. So I don't think of myself as a young person anymore, but I was struck looking at Professor Brendan McKay's graph and realising that I've never lived in a year with a negative temperature anomaly. I would have to be a fair bit older to have actually experienced what that was like. I'm sure it was great at the time. I'd also suggest, to think about heat resilience, we should really, particularly in Queensland, bring back norm of allowing business shorts. I'm struggling through here in denim jeans, but I think that's one highly actionable thing I encourage Griffith University at least to take on board. But I guess I want to start with this chart here. We've heard a bit about heatwave mortality and different ways of thinking about this, but for me this is a very technical but also pretty bloody concerning chart, which is based upon about 20 years of data from Brisbane. And that red line is the relative mortality risk. So that risk is at its lowest point around about 23 degrees. a little bit higher in Brisbane than you see in other Australian cities. And it's at its highest as you get up to that upper end of the chart, above 30 degrees as the sort of median outdoor temperature. Fortunately, in the study, the study period, there weren't that many days that hot, but of course what we are seeing is a shift of that entire histogram at the bottom of that chart to the right, to having more days in those upper levels where you do really see that elevated risk of mortality, which isn't the only negative thing I think we're worried about when we talk about heat resilience, but it's certainly the very pointy end where people die very rapidly from just a few hot nights in a row. And I think that's should really focus our thinking. I did appreciate the introductory remarks about climate change. So I think it's really easy sometimes to think this is just sort of another policy challenge in a whole bucket of policy challenges that we're dealing with, but I think it's a fairly unprecedented policy challenge for humanity, and one that certainly requires an urgency and an attention that we sadly don't often see it getting, but let's see what we can do. So the context that I'm thinking about, I'm from Better Renting. We're a tenant advocacy organisation, and so I guess the perspective I'm interested in bringing is about the people living in homes, particularly renters who are in quite a different position compared to owner-occupiers. And so what's the context of the challenge these people are going to be facing into the future? So I've heard a bit about the increase in heat and the frequency and intensity of heat waves. We also have, of course, more people renting, an upward trend, fewer people who are going to be able to own their home. Increasingly, these people have children in rental properties, and not only is the entire Australian population becoming older and thus more vulnerable to heat impacts, the renting population is also becoming older because historically you get to buy a house by the time you're that age, and that's less and less the case. We also, particularly these days, are seeing a lot more people in marginal housing. So, even if you're lucky enough to be a renter, you might be lucky enough to at least have a house. That's become harder for people. We see more people living in caravan parks, in tents and ovals, couch surfing, sleeping in cars who have particular vulnerabilities, as well as, I guess, people who are sleeping rough. And I think another trend worth keeping in mind is the increasing number of people in apartments. So apartments are disproportionately occupied by renters, and certainly the data show that they tend to have higher rates of mortality in heat waves. They're probably going to be part of what our cities look like going forward, but there are particular challenges there to be thinking about. So before I get to looking to the future, I want to share a bit about some work we did over the last 2 summers, a project called Renter Researchers. So what we do with this project is we recruit renters around Australia. We send them a tracker to record the temperature and humidity inside their home all through the summer. In this case, we've done it the last 2 summers. And you get a really interesting picture, not just of the temperatures, but of how people describe their experiences, because we do a lot of surveys and talking with participants as well. So in Queensland, this is from the most recent summer, which was a hot summer, but not sort of the hottest ones that we're going to be seeing if you think back a few years and probably coming this summer forward. The mean maximum temperature, so across our Queensland participants, mostly in Brisbane, the maximum temperature they were getting on average was about 37 degrees in home. Which isn't that representative, that might just happen one time. But people were spending about 13% of the time, or close to 3 hours a day, with their homes above 30 degrees Celsius. And everyone in our study was spending 50% of the time above 25, at least 50% of the time above 25 degrees Celsius as the median temperature there. This is pretty rough on your body, certainly on your mental health, and really does push you into those danger zones for getting by. We also, as I said, heard from the participants, and I want to share a bit about what people told us about what their experiences were like. I probably won't reread this. I'll let you look over it yourself, but I think it really does help to bring the human element to the fore here. If you haven't got any pictures, that would have helped too. And I think probably one thing I want to draw out that really surprised me maybe when we first did this was that we hear a lot from people who live in old properties that are really awful to live in winter, also really awful to live in summer. There's no insulation. They cook from above because of the heat built up in the ceiling. But we also heard a lot of difficulties from people living in quite recently built apartments, and this was really striking for me. I think part of the problem here is maybe what Liza was saying about fairly lax energy efficiency standards for apartments in particular, but also chatting to some people at the Star Cyro, they were talking about things like you model when they comply with these standards, there's a certain model about how people use their windows. And in reality, people don't use their windows like that. They don't even have a fly screen. They don't want to leave it open because it's too noisy. There's too many mosquitoes. There's traffic. There's a risk there. So I think an actual understanding of what it's like to live in these homes, how people are living in these homes is going to be really important. But on the good news is we can do a lot about this, and we've been hearing a bit about this already. I'd like to highlight a few things. And actually, we've probably heard people who know much more about this than I do. So it's been great to see cool roofs getting a mention. That's going to be really simple, low-hanging fruit there. More green spaces, not just a place you can go, but also has that effect upon the urban environment. External shading is really important, and that's sort of happening at the household level, but trees are also really important at the neighbourhood level. And don't really shade, just like literally cool the surrounding environment through evapotranspiration, whatever that is. Sounds effective to me. Well, we haven't heard much necessarily about sort of what's happening inside individual homes. I really want to say something about the benefit of ceiling fans. Very cost run, very cheap to run, very effective. Moving along, I think a missing piece though is community. And this isn't just a feel good thing, it's pretty empirically backed. So I've got a lovely little study here. And basically the people who are most at risk in heat waves are old people living on their own, who have no one checking in on them. And there's definitely a role around disaster management of actually having someone who gives that person a call, who knocks on their door, who sees how they're going, who invites them out and offers them a glass of water. So I think it's not just going to be a bunch of technical fixes. This might be sort of a top-down solution, but even just also a bottom-up solution and that sort of level of community aid. At the policy level, though, there's a lot of things we'd love to see the state government get cracking on. So we've heard about changes to the National Construction Code to make sure buildings themselves are built to a higher standard of energy performance. That's going to be really important for heat resilience. At better renting, we'd really love to see a higher minimum standard for existing rental properties, requiring measures like ceiling insulation, which can really help, as I said, and the Queensland government has been pretty lax on that so far. But I would highlight here that there's this lovely study about the Melbourne heat wave going back, which found that if the buildings had been of a higher energy efficiency standard, heat wave mortality could have been reduced by about 90% there. So that's modelling getting properties up to 5.4 stars, which is pretty ambitious, but also 90% reduction in heat wave mortality sounds pretty good to me. So I'll leave it there. Love to see a bit more heat wave resilience, and we can achieve it in our homes, in our communities.
Wonderful, thank you, Joel, and all of our panelists. I might invite our panelists to move to the front and turn their chairs towards the audience, so we might start our questions and answers session, please. We had to keep the lights down for the backdrop, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to see it. But now that we're done with that, we can actually have some proper lighting. Now, just to resituate everybody's thinking on this, we're here today to discuss what a heat resilient Queensland will look like in 2033. I don't have a clear answer to that. I'm sure nobody really does. That's what we're here to sort of work out. I have a set of questions that I could put to the panelists, but before I interrogate them, does anybody in the audience or online want to throw us a curly one to get started? Sue Harris-Rimmer from the Climate Justice Observatory, Griffith.
Yes, so I'm interested in extreme heat for the rise. So
Just 1 second, Sue. I think we have a microphone actually.
Oh, I'm pretty loud. People have live on. Oh yeah. I'm not loud enough for that.
There's a couple here. I'll give you.
No worries. Hi, I'm Sue Harris-Rimmer from the Climate Action Beacon, and I'm interested in extreme heat and human rights. So I was just thinking about what you were saying, Mark, about community planning. Very concerned about people who take public transport and rent. So I'm thinking about, the perspective of vulnerable Queenslanders who might live in an outer suburb. Quite a lot of the recent deaths in India and Pakistan were people who live in an outer suburb who take public transport to an outdoor job, and then, so that's the kind of issues we're thinking about. What can we do around bus shelters, train stations, ferry stops, you know, trying to make them fit for purpose, because old people will stay home if they can't get out in a safe way out of their house.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're actually seeing, you know, the Sunshine Coast is probably a bad example for use of public transport, probably the worst going around, whereas a collection of villages that people feel compelled to drive because it's just not efficient using public transport when you have to then go and change mode shift. What we are starting to look at though is this strong movement towards active transport, particularly within our communities. And Sunshine Coast is blessed with a lot of bike paths. So at Aura, we've been creating a bike city, so dedicated off-road bike valetways, which we're then looking at our different nodes at the end of, be it, you know, shopping centres or at schools. So we want to be able to ensure that people can adequately get out of their cars, leave them at home, and use active transport to be able to cycle or scooter or whatnot to their main destinations. So we know with that change and that push, we have to then look at a design response. So we talk about our shelters, our end of trip bike facilities, but also then that journey. So you're providing shade along the way. So you know, we've got a priority where we actually want to amp up with our future communities that active transport, but we know when we do that, we have to look at that design response. Otherwise, as per my first slide, people just won't use them because it's just not comfortable. And then we'll end up people just in cars anymore.
Maybe think about Mount Isa and Birdsville, where all the playgrounds, they burn you if you touch them. It's like, yeah, that's just great. It's like all that money they spent on, it was the GFC money they spent on playgrounds in Queensland, and none of them are fit for purpose. They're not shaded.
Anyone else want to have a crack at this?
Sorry.
Brendan as well.
Okay. I catch public transport a lot. I think they're doing a lot of upgrades currently, and they seem to be including a lot of shade, thank goodness. And there seems to be a landscape component to that, which will also help as well. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I know that the Green Olympics are coming, and I know they're looking at all sorts of incredible things with walkways between venues, shaded, and I'm very excited about that. I can't wait to see what they're actually planning.
Go to the next question. Okay.
I actually was just going to have a non-design related answer to that. And I think we have people working from home now, and we have them working from home because of COVID and a whole lot of other things. But there's an opportunity now for employers to start looking at changing working hours, not just working from home, so that people are coming to work either earlier in the morning and going home before it gets too hot, or starting in the afternoon and working later on. Obviously dependent upon the job, but it's a non-design solution that might also impact a number of people.
Yes, that's a very good point. And of course, in southern Spain and elsewhere in the Mediterranean, this was in common practice for a long time. People started very early, had a long siesta during the heat of the day, and worked in the evening and ate late. So, good observation. The other comment to make more generally about transportation, not just public transportation, is huge impacts from heat waves. Planes have trouble, jet planes have trouble taking off. Jet engines don't work as well. They have trouble getting lift, etc. Railway lines can buckle. So it's just a general observation that there are also heat wave impacts on transportation systems generally.
Wonderful. Luke has a question. You have a microphone, Luke? Great.
Luke Reed from Energetic Communities, where we work closely with Joel and others around the country on energy efficiency and minimum standards for rentals. So my question is one for Liza and one for Mark. So we've got a new housing minister. Queensland government in their last housing review, so the Residential Tenancies Act, rejected energy efficiency minimum standards, and one of the reasons they gave is it would cost too much to bring the housing quality up to National Construction Code quality, even though no one was asking for that. And Liza, you mentioned you do a bit of education and advocacy. That's right. So I used to be a government environment officer at Brisbane and Redlands, so I kind of know the space a bit. But my question for you is around what role do you think local government can have around advocacy? Because in Queensland we have the Power Together initiative, and we have social service, unions, faith-based groups, environmental groups, working for a whole bunch of things. We have 8 main asks, one of which is around minimum standards for rentals. So the question is, what do you think the role of local government is around advocacy? And Mark, for yourself, a few years back, the Queensland government did a bunch of sector adaptation plans around climate adaptation, and the built environment one from the green space was rubbish. It really wasn't mentioned. And so again, for yourselves in that corporate space where you'll be doing all the upgrades and the cost of, or the advantage of going, say, from 6, 7, 8 stars is less, it kind of tapers off. So we're asking for like 4 or 5 star rather than 7 star, the National Construction Code. So the question is, what role could corporates have in getting the state government to sign up to, at a very minimum, roof or ceiling insulation, let alone features, but performance-based standards. So 2 questions.
Where do we start? Oh goodness. Okay, right. Well, I spend every day at work trying really hard to make buildings better. Yes, and a lot of it isn't expensive. A lot of it is just sensible, thinking laterally, good design. It's not hard. Some of the stuff that as we move towards 7 stars, NatHERS stars, that is, you can get 6 green stars and that's awesome. Or you can get 7 NatHERS stars and that's out of 10, that's not so awesome. Anyway, but that's better than what we've currently got, which is 4. And 4 is really, that's for apartments, it's not good. Houses are currently, I think, we're supposed to be getting 6, and that's pretty good. But I should mention that one of the issues we have in Queensland, I forgot to mention it before, is that we, alongside the legislation that says we only have to get so many stars, we've got other legislation through the National Construction Code, which means that we have limiters on all the windows on the 2nd floor of buildings, or anything above 1,500, I think. Is that wrong? Anyway, but essentially, windows can only open for 100 millimetres. So we're not getting cross ventilation. It's not happening. And the NCC measures the opening size of windows from the frame. So there's a big problem at the moment with the way all of these systems work, in that they're really not good at airflow and air measurements. And if you've ever looked at a wind tunnelling report, it's a really specialist area. We need more people to get good at it really fast, because it's really important. It's really subtle, but it makes a huge difference to physiological cooling, which can reduce the feeling of the body by 6 degrees. So it's important as well as fans. So in my job, I talk a lot about fans. I talk a lot about cross ventilation. Those things don't cost money. They just cost 2 windows instead of 1, because you can just get some cross ventilation if you have to. Anyway, it's simple. We can do a lot with not very much. And I think the Nightingale example in Victoria is really interesting, because that product is walking out the door. They've got waiting lists. And what it is really good design. And I don't mean to be the designer in the room, but it's really good design, and it's minimalist. So it's like shells of concrete, which are beautiful shells of concrete with exposed piping, but people really want it. So we can do things better or less. And I guess that's what we've got to aim for. And why shouldn't that be 7 stars? I don't know. I think it should be.
Difficult one to answer. I mean, it's not my specialty, looking at sort of housing stars and insulation and those sorts of things. But what I can say is that the engaging with the development industry and communicating with them and look at a coordinated approach is really important. So we've got the Urban Development Institute of Australia and the Property Council. So definitely engaging with them to communicate what the benefits are, because ultimately, if we can, there is a benefit to the customer, a benefit to our communities, and benefit to the cost value proposition, you will get the attention. But then you look at new legislation that's coming in for, was it October, for the accessible housing? You know, that has been an absolute massive change for the industry. People sort of scratching their heads about, well, that's going to add significant cost to building a home. And we're already in a sort of a housing crisis to make housing more sort of accessible for the future. Now, those sorts of, each initiative adds to the cost, and it just needs to be broadly considered about what those benefits are, and more engage more broadly with the industry to get the right outcomes for government.
I think I was referring a bit to the agency of those sectors, so low income and rentals. So the cost can come down. It actually doesn't matter for renters who don't get to make that decision. And so that's where the regulation comes in. And just on your point there, like supply chain is going to be a massive issue, but we also need to build smaller. We're building way too big in Australia. That's another piece of it.
Yep.
Further questions from the floor? Nope. Okay, I've got one for you all, which really picks up on much of what we're talking about, but in a slightly more general way, let's say. And that question is, how can we ensure that vulnerable populations, and by vulnerable I mean groups such as the elderly or low-income residents, those living in rural and remote locations, those with disabilities and so forth, how can we ensure that they're not disproportionately impacted by extreme heat events under a changing climate? What can we do? What are our options across design, policy, government intervention and so forth?
I'll start on a policy government point of view, and I think meaningful inclusion are two words that we at the IGEM office are really consider important. And it's not just about consulting with someone and ticking a box to say, yes, I've consulted with this group. It's about involving vulnerable people in designing the plans that are appropriate for where they're living. And we talk about rural and remote communities, but I think we need to add a word, isolated. People can be rural or remote, they can be urban, but they can still be isolated. And we need to ensure, whether it's through advocacy groups or other government agencies, that we engage with everyone in a meaningful way so that we can consider their needs and their desires in the plans we make in response to disaster management. And for us, if we look at bushfires, which contribute to heat, it's about understanding First Nations practices and using them in the way we manage our wildlands. It's about understanding the waterways from a First Nations point of view as to where to dam or where not to dam, and how we might be able to harvest the water in a better way. Let's not suck the artesian bore dry every time there's a drought, because that's the lifeblood of the whole of the country. It's not just about one small part where there's a bore. And for people with disabilities and vulnerable populations, there are some really wonderful advocacy groups in Queensland out there. We just need to make sure we, as an office, engage with them to make sure the plans that are in place are suitable for the needs of their clients. Warnings need to be in more than one language, and they need to be written in a way that someone can understand. So the literacy standard in Australia generally is around about 12 to 14 years of age. And yet you look at some of the warnings that come out from government departments and agencies, they're so complicated. They use terms like evacuate your home. Some languages don't have the word evacuate in them. So we should be starting to think of simple, clear language like leave now, go now, things like that, so that the messaging we give out is easily translatable, easily understood. And if it's with a vulnerable community or a person living with a disability, make sure your plans are in place before the event happens, so that the local government or the local police service or SES, whoever's responding, actually understands the needs of the person they're going to rescue before they go and do it.
So thank you. Anyone else?
I think from our perspective, it's really going to start with urban design response. So looking at how we can design better for urban heat island resilience. So that means different types of product from a housing perspective, different percentages of open space. So when we're looking at probably more dense housing options, but then more open space to compensate, which you can then look for rewilding. Minimum targets associated with providing social housing and obviously accessible housing. So just looking at how we actually design our communities differently to accommodate not just the vulnerable, but also broad sector of customers and people. And yes, it needs to be tailored regionally as well, depending on what their needs and financial capacities are.
So we all love this one. I've just got to say that everybody is vulnerable at some point in their lives, and quite often people move into a building and become vulnerable in 30 years' time or something like that. So I think a lot of the people who died in Paris and New York in heat waves died because they were old and they were trapped in their buildings and they couldn't get out. So it is incredibly important that we know our neighbours, we know how to get people out, and we have the ability to get people out. Now, I think in a lot of high rises at the moment, so if there's a fire, you have to, if you're disabled, you have to wait outside the fire escape stair and wait for someone to come and rescue you. So there's some things we need to think about how we actually get people out of buildings who are vulnerable. The other thing we need to think about is what we do with them when we get them out. There was a heat wave last year, I think it was December, and a lot of the old people had been in my local area, which is Sunshine Coast where I live. There was all of these people who were shipped to the RSL on a bus, old people. The RSL air conditioning failed in a blackout, and the place was full of old vulnerable people who couldn't get home and they were stuck there. So they shipped them out. They had to find chairs and put them in a car park and then give them water to drink until they could arrange for someone to come and pick them up. So we have to look at the refuges that people go to and make sure that they are capable of withstanding disasters as well.
And let's make sure those refuges aren't pokies venues. I think I want to add on this that vulnerability is not a fact. And I think we can talk about let's help the people who are vulnerable, but I think we can also talk about let's help people not to be vulnerable. Sometimes it's going to be harder than others, but if people are vulnerable because their income is too low, there are pretty direct things that the Commonwealth Government in particular can do to address that, so that people can actually not just afford to run air conditioning, but can afford to buy a fan, can afford to go to a mall and buy a cool drink on a hot day. It's not just accepting that people are going to be vulnerable, whether we like it or not.
Yes, I agree with that. And if there's one projection about climate change, which we're absolutely 100% rock solid about and for which there's no escape, is we're going to have more frequent, severe and longer heat waves. Right? That's just locked in. And why should anyone in Australia living in a house that doesn't have required amount of insulation and ceiling fans and airflow, why are we allowing that to happen? I just think we need to take action to, if it's through standards or star ratings, whatever it is, or retrofitting as well. I mean, I just think we need to accept that this is just shouldn't be socially acceptable. I think we are going to have to look at places where, as we do with floods and bushfires and things, places where people can take refuge during heat waves. There was an interesting Australian written Netflix series on a couple of years called The Commons, which I can recommend you all watch. It was set in the near future in Australia, maybe 1930, during a major heat wave event, and the government issued an order that made every office and apartment block in every CBD open their foyers to whoever needed to take refuge, because people needed to take refuge in the city, and apartment buildings and offices just got filled with thousands and thousands of people taking refuge. Now, that's actually not such a far-fetched scenario. If you think of having a heat wave for 30 days above 40 degrees, right? Some kind of public response like that may well be needed. So, I as I said, just to repeat myself, why is anyone in Australia living in a house or an apartment doesn't have ceiling fans and adequate insulation and airflow?
Or openable windows.
Or an openable window.
Do you have a question?
We have some online as well.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Regional maybe. I'm Shannon Haynes from Moreton Bay Regional Council. All the presentations have been
wonderful, very informative. And look, it's probably to everyone on the panel, my question, and I think if we take what Mr. Mackey was saying, that, you know, we're currently tracking at, well, we're at 1.1 degrees, expected to hit 1.5 degrees in the next 8 to 10 years, which makes me very, very nervous. I'm a town planner, by the way, I should have said that up front, and I just know how slow policy and planning legislative frameworks take to be reviewed and updated. I think it's fair to say that our frameworks haven't kept up to date with all these changes. My question is, how do we break the obsession that I think a lot of people have, where we have, you know, the small lots, the big building footprints, so we don't have a lot of yard, there's not a lot of space to plant a tree. I think what Aura is doing is amazing, like trialling technologies, the cool roofs, the cool pavements. How do we rank that up and, you know, break that obsession with the big building footprints, small lot size, and step up the, you know, taking up these cool strategies in urban development across the board?
I'll hand this to all of those, but I do just want to know, because I mentioned Southern Spain because my brother lives there, married a Spanish woman and lives in Seville, and their home and the building code in Seville is an old one, but every house, every building has to have an interior courtyard for air ventilation by law. Yeah. And it's the minimum size. So whether it's 1, 2, 3 or 4, however many stories, it's always interior. It is a heat response treatment.
I'll try and answer this from a policy point of view. It might be a bit difficult, but we have resilient funding, disaster resilient funding from the federal government through the Queensland Reconstruction Authority to build back better, to retrofit homes and to move them out of flood zones. And I think we've got to get government to make the link between building a heat resilient home. It may not burn down, you may not have to replace it, but the money you save through the health system and the money you save through all the other government services that are provided when someone succumbs to heat. So perhaps a link between how much money you can spend retrofitting homes and making them more heat resilient versus how much money that then saves. Generally speaking, if we spend $1 in prevention and preparedness, we save $7 in response and recovery. And I would assume that that would translate across to heat as well. So it's about getting people to understand the link between saving money by spending money.
I don't think we can get any smaller. We keep saying that, but then they keep getting a little bit smaller in terms of some of the housing. But a lot of that is a direct result of also affordability and trying to provide products for people to enter the housing market, and then the change of our demographics. So many single people, single families, and people that just can't afford to live in big homes anymore. I actually personally think bring back Melrose Place from the 90s. Was it the 90s? Melrose Place. Yeah. So was it the 90s? Yeah. So it had a courtyard, had open space, communal areas. So, but I actually think that change the design I was alluding to before really needs to be looked at. Australians aren't big on community title developments and paying body corporate fees. We've had this obsession with having a backyard so we can play cricket in and having the hills hoist out the back and everything else. That quarter-acre block quandary has changed, even though people still want their patch of Aussie dirt, they still want their home, they still want their private space. But I think that role of, and I joked about Melrose Place, but changes in the way that our urban form is and the governance structures associated with that will provide more opportunities for a reduced footprint, but a bigger space in terms of internally. Yes, you lose your private open space, but that becomes sort of more communal. But what we're facing is more communal. But what we're starting to see is that small block and that reduced backyard is being translated into open space. So the investment is then going into the parks and the playgrounds and everything else. It's not an easy one to fix when affordability is such a strong driver. No, I didn't answer your question, but bring back the photo.
I'd agree with Melrose. I think it was pink too, wasn't it? So cool. But look, I don't agree with losing private open space. I will never agree with that because it does go back to the courtyard system. It's not only good for, you know, beautiful places to work, live and play, but it's also incredibly important for cross ventilation because it brings air into the centre of the house. It brings in light in winter. It does lots of things. It allows buildings to cross ventilate. It allows you to have some greening in the centre of a building if you put some plants there, or water, as they do in Spain, and a lot of, I think some of the old Spanish villas had all these beautiful water features through their buildings, through the centre. So at the heart of a good design is an open space. That's weird, isn't it? But it is. And even some of the most tight, dense urban fabrics we've got in Australia, which is places like Paddington in Sydney, have courtyards. They have little front little patches of green, which are quite beautiful, and they have central courtyards in the middle, often where the chooks used to live, and then where they used to have their outhouses, they've got another building, and sometimes they're linked up now. So it's creation of that central green space in the middle of tight urban form that makes things work. Now, Stockland's have done a great development in Moreton Bay at North Lakes called Vida, which had that, a very small central courtyard, but it worked perfectly, designed by John Mayroon. So I don't mind small buildings, I don't mind small footprints, but what we need to have is good design that works with air and sun as well. You know, so we need to be looking at heat, but we need to be looking at air. Okay.
I'll have a crack at this one, thanks. I guess I feel like your question's sort of like, people want big houses, what do we do? And I think like this is sort of a sociological question, cultural question. There's definitely a role for that sort of expertise in helping us to understand this. I think Mark is sort of an industry rep here is in a bit of a bind because people sort of think what they want and to some extent you've got to deliver that to them. But like, where do people learn what they want? And I think it's a little bit of a chicken egg situation here where the industry is constantly telling people, we can give you the big house of your dreams. And if you look at real estate ads, every one of them is like, oh, break free from strata fees, buy your own place, you know, don't have to share decision making with anyone. So industry responds to these norms, but they also shape them. And, you know, something needs to break that cycle. I don't know about Queensland planning law, and this, you said yourself you're a planner, but I think it's also, we can think about the role of planning here. In the ACT at least, a lot of the zoning, if you have a big block, you can only build a big house on it. And you can actually have, it doesn't quite make sense to me. It's not about the size of the dwelling, it's about how many dwellings it is. So rather than have 4 small dwellings that add up to say 200 square metres, probably more, you're allowed to have one huge ass dwelling, but not 4 more smaller ones. So I think there's also a role for planning here in terms of what's allowed on the land.
And I think, can we take 2 questions from online and then we'll have to start drawing things towards a close.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Sorry to everyone online. I have a fair few questions, so I'll just I'll cut to the chase. So one that we got was from Maria Anselmo. Apologies if I'm saying your name wrong, Maria. And Maria has said, Queensland is a large area with various ecosystems. Here in far north Queensland, we are facing heat wave coupled with high humidity. How do we ensure heatwave solutions for Queensland address the unique challenges across Queensland communities?
Right. This sounds like a human X question.
No, sorry. There's some fantastic work being done through JCU with the Tropical Urban Design Lab up there. They're also looking at work in Darwin as well. They're doing work in Darwin through the CSIRO, and there's all sorts of interesting research that they're doing that basically shows that in those areas, particularly in Darwin, if you have greater space between the buildings with more greenery and more opportunities for opening, you get better cross ventilation and people are more comfortable without air conditioning. Part of that is because they have a higher heat tolerance. Their comfort zone is higher than, say, us southerners. So there's a few different things at play there, but it's actually really quite interesting. But it's to do with space, air, and greenery, and they're the solutions. And shading. Shading's huge. Shading everywhere is huge.
So it's a very good question because Queensland does vary enormously in terms of rainfall. And one of the challenges with urban tree planting and planting of vegetation for cooling effects is it's green because it's photosynthesizing and evapotranspirizing, and that's because it takes about, plants have to transpire about 20 litres of water to produce 1 kilogram of biomass, right? So it's very, photosynthesis, being green is a very thirsty process. So there's a trade-off between having urban plantings which are drought resistant and don't use much water, and plantings which are green and cooling and shading. And again, where you need to look at that trade-off varies where you go in Queensland. Obviously, in a place that's got high rainfall most of the year, you don't have to worry about water stress on your plants and conserving water. But obviously, large areas of Queensland you do. So that's an interesting aspect for urban design, and the role of greening urban design for cooling is this trade-off with water use, water availability.
Thank you so much. So I'll just, and I apologise everyone online, I'll just grab another question from Emma Bacon from Sweltering Cities. So she said regarding the National Construction Code, an update in October will update the climate data from 1965 to 1990 to 1990 to 2015. Even this does not reflect the current, let alone future climate. We know this distorts energy efficient ratings in Western Sydney, which is considered to be predominantly a cool climate, and some other areas. Has this been looked at in Queensland?
Gosh. Look, it has been, and lots of councils are doing lots of work in this area quietly, which is very exciting and quite fun. And lots of universities are working with councils on looking at people. Right? But I know Toowoomba has just done an amazing thing that's actually been published and is available online, and they've realised they were supposed to be subtropical like the rest of us, and they worked out through their weather data, which they were collecting and working with USQ about, that they're actually warm temperate. So everything about the way that they addressed construction was not quite correct. So it's actually about collecting data and then analysing it and realising how we're all changing. It's going to keep changing. We may not be subtropical for long, I'm not sure. So, we all have to keep working in that space because it's evolving. Like that.
Thanks for that question. Emma's also from Sweltering Cities, and I didn't get time to mention it, but they did a community survey about heat and health, the summer survey, which came out the summer before last. That's a really good resource to check out, particularly, again, for that human perspective. I think to this question, I think it was Shannon had this question about like the pace of decision making. I think one of the problems we've seen is decision making happening really slow, then making a decision that's not even suitable for the present day, let alone the future. And I think with the NCC changes, the latest change is to 7 stars, but there have been many iterations prior to that where there was no upgrade, and it was actually at 6 stars for quite a long time, in which time hundreds of thousands of properties have probably been built that could have been built to a higher standard. I'm probably not so optimistic we'll see it keep ticking up in the next few things. But perhaps as a hopeful principle, we could, particularly given the pace of decision-making processes, try to make decisions that are going to be a bit more future-proof well beyond the cycle, just the next iteration.
There's probably time for one more quick one from online, and then we'll start rounding things out.
Awesome. Okay.
Also, while you're answering the last question, could I ask you all please to think of maybe 3 key bullet points that you might give us as a takeaway, where one of the things we want to do after today is produce a call to action. We're not going to do it at the end of today, but we're trying to synthesize all the key thinking from today into a series of key points, which we'll then take to our advisory group and discuss and try to produce a call to action. So one of the things we really like to collect from you while we have you is 3 more key points. They can be pulled out of your presentation or from anywhere. We really don't mind, but Shannon will furiously jot them down and record them as well, but they'll be very important to us. So during this last question, please do think about that also.
All right, so I have a really big question here from Elizabeth Harrison. I'm not quite sure where she's from, so apologies, Elizabeth. And she said, it's great that the acting IGEM person is here, reinforcing the onerous on what disasters bring to the people of Queensland, and hence the bill to the Queensland government. So she has a couple of questions, but the first one is, where is the onus on proactive measures as opposed to reactive measures? And then second, the mention of Queensland Health in the agency is great, but where's the Queensland Planning Department representation? And then lastly, when are we going to change planning regulations and legislation so they prioritise the environment effects, aka heat with nature? And when are we going to put pressure on developers, creating heat instead of dissipating it, encouraging nature?
Thank you, and 3 really good questions. I can probably only speak to 2 of them. Where is the pressure on spending money in terms of preparedness and prevention instead of response and recovery? I would invite everyone to have a look at our most recent review, which is online at our website, www.igem.qld.gov.au, because it talks about shifting the focus from response and recovery to prevention and preparedness. And it talks about the savings to be made. And it's always difficult to measure something that doesn't happen, and to convince people that spending money here will save you by not spending money over there. And it's something really difficult to measure. But the onus that we're providing to people is that we're checking your plans and we're making sure that they're specifically ready for what is facing us into the future. So a local government or a state department who has a plan that was written 3 years ago should know that it's probably not suitable for next year. And whilst we're not an audit agency with audit powers, the power of polite inquiry gets you a lot of places. And by working on reviews that government taskers can do, we can engage with departments who need help by putting them in touch with people and places and organisations that can help them design better plans. The QPS is about to take over disaster management generally from the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, who've done a great job up until now. But we now, with the QPS, you'll have more people in more places, I suppose. It's a bigger footprint across the state for a government department, which means people in smaller, more isolated communities have somewhere to go to at least start their inquiries about disaster management. But it's really the economics. If you're going to save $7 for every $1 you spend, there's really no other argument. The Queensland Reconstruction Authority is responsible for building resilience in the state, and they have some really good programs online on their website. So I would encourage people to go and have a look at that as well and engage with them. Now, the second question.
The second question was, the mention of Queensland Health in the agency is great, so where is the Queensland Planning Department representation?
Well, they're involved firstly in terms of planning buildings and communities that are going to be disaster resilient and not building any more on floodplains, or if you're going to build on a floodplain, building a building that's flood resistant, flood resilient. So they're certainly involved in that sort of thing. But I mentioned earlier the State Disaster Management Group, which is comprised of all of the Directors General of all the government departments. So the Director General is involved in that group. As you look through our disaster management system, we have both a State Disaster Coordination Group, which is essentially responding to a disaster as it happens. We have the State Resilience and Recovery Group, which is tasked with not only making the recovery from a disaster event happen, but also building resilience into that recovery. And the Department of Local Government is involved in chairing that and drafting the new terms of reference with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. So they are very much involved in the policy sense. they are very much involved in things like the Build Back Better scheme and also the buyback scheme that the Resilient Housing Fund, which is co-funded by the Queensland Government, and it's about moving people out of flood areas if they want to move, like Grantham. It's about retrofitting homes, and it's about redesigning new homes to go back to ones that are damaged. I think I'm not quite sure I can speak to the third question.
I can talk to the developer one. Yeah. And just, I guess, a little bit of an insight in terms of planning. In Queensland, it takes 10 to 15 years to get a development started, to get it approved, which is far too long. So even a place like Aura, which is industry leading, planning for that started in 2000 and the master plan in 2010, 2011. So we're looking at plans which are then locked into infrastructure agreements and everything from 10, 15 years ago. What we're actually planning and looking at now for the future, I'm extremely positive about where it's headed in relation to how we're tackling issues such as what we've been talking about today. And even I know that when, as an organisation, we're looking at our bids for either infill, whatever project it might be, we're focusing on nature positive strategies, on how we can be net zero by 2028, and bringing that forward. So I actually feel that from a development industry perspective, we've caught up. Planning hasn't caught up, but the more that these issues come to light, particularly in relation to governance, planning, approvals, looking at it with the whole lens of how we talk to the development industry, I believe we can make some quicker changes, which is going to help fast track what we need to do.
Thank you.
Mark. Okay, I think that's about as much time as we have for questions. With apologies to any other questions from our online audience. If there's anyone in the room who has a pressing question, you'll have an opportunity to ask it while we have refreshments afterwards, so please don't worry about that. We'll be here for a while yet. But just as we start to wind things up, as I said, I'm throwing you each a short challenge, please, which would be 3 quick points from your own perspective and from your own position to take away from today, with particular reference to this notion of, well, what does a heat resilient Queensland in 2033 look like? Please don't feel like we're going to hold you to these or anything, but we certainly appreciate your thoughts. Thank you, Brendan.
Yeah, thanks. So my 3 points would be, one, it's clear that the climate's going to keep changing for decades before. Let's be optimistic, assume that mitigation ambition is increased and we do limit global warming to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Realistically, we can hope for that, even demand and expect that. Still going to see a serious increase in heat waves and related heat impacts. But the good news is that there's an awful lot we can do about that in terms of mitigating that risk for people, and we have the knowledge already. We know how to design new developments, and we know how to retrofit existing developments and buildings and homes, and none of that is particularly expensive. It's just intelligent design and simple retrofitting. And I think the other good news is that will stand the test of time. If we implement what we know now, it will deal with the rising temperatures in decades to come quite well. But the third point is that is still going to require a lot of proactive policy and legislation on the part of governments at all levels of all kinds, and as well, I think we are going to need some innovative policies and designs that we haven't had to deal with yet. But I think in the main, there's a lot that can be done. We just have to get proactive about it. It's in the legislation that it's a natural disaster, but we're not treating it like we are treating bushfires and floods. And if we get to that, what was the first P?
Prevention.
We need to get into the prevention mode.
Thank you. I suppose I'll start with Queensland is unique. So a cookie cutter, one size fits all approach won't work. There are 77 local government areas in Queensland and 1 town authority, which is Weipa. And those local governments and that town authority need to design solutions that are suitable to their area. And they can have the state planning laws and the national construction codes, but they need to make sure that they adapt them or adopt them to suit their own circumstances. So please, locally led. It's not just a locally led response, it's locally led in terms of how you set your community up to prepare, prevent, plan for a disaster. The second thing is it's a shared responsibility which brings a shared accountability. There's a term called learned helplessness, which I'm loath to use in Queensland, but you certainly see it in some places where it's what's the government doing for me? Where is the government? Why haven't I been saved? Why haven't I been rescued? And in some circumstances, it's a very valid criticism of the emergency services. But in other situations, it's about what have you done to prevent or protect yourself from the impact of the disaster event. So the shared responsibility brings a shared accountability for you to do something yourself, whether it's in accepting that the house that you're building is not going to be the 2-storey McMansion that perhaps you want, but it's more suited to the climate or the area where you're living. And the third thing is get involved. You know, there's a lot of people who would love to listen to your circumstance and try and understand a different way of doing things. But if we don't know what your situation is or what your unique challenges might be, it's very difficult for policymakers to design something that's going to impact you in a positive way if we don't understand. So get involved. There are plenty of advocacy groups and representative groups. Please use them because we're interested in working together with you to design a better future as well as develop better policy that will work in the future.
Mine's cool groups for number one. Why aren't we doing it really in Queensland? We're probably the only community that's mandated it, and it's been a bit of a no-brainer. So those low-hanging fruits, we should just be doing it anyway. 2 is research, validation, and education, communication. So where you've got willing organisations who want to try and learn more to make more resilient communities, we're happy to partner with educational institutions, research, because unless we can validate the science and then communicate it effectively about what the benefits are, no one's going to take it up because everyone's just too busy with their day job. So there needs to be some effective communication. And I think with that, it comes into how we respond to product and design and bring back the place.
Okay, Melrose Place is throwing me off. I was going to say, learn from history, because there's so many great examples in traditional cultures about how to live in heat. We've got the examples of Spain we've spoken about, but there's all sorts of desert cultures who have amazing ways of handling heat. Wind fires, deep wells under buildings, there are all sorts of really interesting ways of doing it. Hopefully we won't get to that point, but even just thinking about how my grandparents lived in country Queensland with sheets over the windows that they'd spray with water when it was hot so the airflow was evaporatively cooled. There's all sorts of tricks we can learn if we look back at history and pick up some of the hacks. So learn from history, adapt. We're all going to have to adapt our buildings for a greater heat climate, hotter climate, so there's going to be huge amounts of work. It should be very exciting for us all because we're going to be busy for a long time to come in adaptation. And the other thing we need to do is become more resilient as humans. A lot of the houses that are being designed now are kind of like insulated boxes where people drive to in their insulated cars and get out in the insulated boxes and lead an insulated life. The future is about sharing and caring. Get out of your boxes, break them open, get the airflow in, open the windows, and have a nice life. That's my plan.
Right. So my 3 points, one is obviously a call to action for minimum energy efficiency standards for rentals. I'd like to emphasise that literally you listening to this could go home and write an email to Minister Megan Scanlon and tell her to do this. So file that one away in your noggin. You really could. That's very true. The second thing, I guess, is what we do with our cities, is the urban design layer, is the streetscape, is the trees, is the blue spaces, the green spaces. So that's going to be a really important area of intervention. And I guess to end on, I want to speak about mitigation. I think adaptation is going to be really important. There's heat on the way, but we really can't give up. And every additional tonne of carbon dioxide that doesn't get emitted between now and eventual net zero is going to make a difference. I think renewable energy is a really good, important thing there, which I guess not only helps with that, but also means there's going to be cheaper energy for people to actually deal with some of these challenges too.
Fantastic, thank you all. You rose to the challenge extremely well. Can I ask you all, our audience, both online and in person, to join me in thanking our panelists for their fantastic presentations, and also for their wonderful willingness to answer tough questions. To those people online, we bid you farewell shortly. We thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you, and we will make a recording of this available soon enough. Everybody in the room is welcome to join us for refreshments and further conversation. So on that note, I'll draw to a close. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh yes, we do, yes. Ella has gifts for the panelists as well. We wouldn't let you go home empty-handed.
Yeah. Actually, compared to what's working
This is a cool model because you also think about safety, right? And there's some things in there that would be good to see. Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, there are some things in there that are important to keep cool, but thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you, Joel. There's a small bag. Thank you for food. So food safety, obviously.
appropriate. Thank you, Brendan. Yeah.
Thank you. That'll be my
Learning.
Thank you.